Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a website or domain, go to squarespace.com/GeorgeHolden for 10% off your first purchase. Street photography is about much more than empty streets and pretty snapshots.
Really?
That's right, sunshine. In this video, I'm going to show you 5 different ways to bring your street photography compositions to life. Starting with people and life itself, because without people and life in our images might feel lifeless. So we need to add that stuff back in to the recipe, like Chemical X.
Chemical X.
Including a human subject in your images is one thing, but if that human subject is actively doing something that we can relate to, or is interacting with part of the environment or another subject, that makes our images much more interesting for the viewer. When you find your scene that you're going to photograph, pay attention to the subjects who already exist in the area. What are they doing? Who is animated? Who is actively engaged in doing something? And who looks like they're about to do something? Now, this animation or activity could look like anything. This could be a group deciding which way they're going and they're pointing all over the place. This could be someone having a super stressful phone call, grabbing onto the side of their head, like I like to shoot. Or this could be someone clutching an item behind their back or struggling to carry something across the street. These actions allow us to feel life in our images, and they spark curiosity within the viewer who is looking at your image. Before we move on to color contrast, next week I'll be back with a video on methods of 35mm street photography, so make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out when that video drops. Colour plays a massive part in your images, both in how we draw the viewer's attention from one part of the image to another, and also in how it helps us convey our ideas through our photography. We can easily be drawn to the bright, colourful subjects on the streets, and that's a good thing, but it's especially good when we can actually pair that subject with another subject with complementary colour or contrasting colours in the environment around them. Looking at some examples from a recent trip that I went on with my Lumix GX80. I noticed several opportunities to be able to use colour contrast between the blue of the ocean and the skin tones of multiple different subjects. I'm not much of a seascape photographer, so where these images would have been kind of dull and lifeless when shot by me, it was nice to have something with colourful contrast to be able to draw the viewer's attention and for me to be able to find an anchoring point in my compositions. If you ever feel stuck with colour contrast and how to kind of get started at spotting the right sort of colour contrast on the street, try to keep the colour wheel in mind. Whether you're editing in Lightroom, you'll notice the colour wheel sometimes, or just look at a graphic from the internet. Having these opposite complementary colours in your mind mean that when you're out on the street shooting, you can notice those opportunities and include them in your compositions. I'd like to take a moment to share with you the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace for long before they sponsored the channel, and I operate my membership through Squarespace, where I deliver exclusive content and downloads for my members. I also love publishing my free monthly newsletter through Squarespace, and the process couldn't be any easier for someone who hasn't run email campaigns before. Their easy to use templates and drag and drop design mean that you can make a professional looking website without any prior web design skills. So why not get started at squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/GeorgeHolden to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Let's call this segment Colour Part 2, the colourful two towers, the colourful attack of the clones. No, so colour and patterns can be a really playful way to be able to communicate your ideas through your photography. So let's look at these 2 examples to be able to understand a little bit about how we can use colour in patterns to be able to complement and contrast our subjects. Firstly, here we have a subject walking towards the camera, only they're wearing an umbrella hat with the rainbow spectrum of colours around it. And actually they're walking underneath a set of rainbow spectrum flags almost in the exact same order, hanging just above them, above their umbrella coloured hat. It's safe to say, when I saw this opportunity, I got very excited and I ran all the way down the street to be able to get this shot. But this could have worked with just block colours. But the fact that we have the same sequence of colours, same spectrum on both the rainbow hat and the flags above them, just makes this a much more playful image that pretty much anyone from any language can understand when they look at it. Secondly, I want to show you 2 different images with 2 different setups of patterned prints kind of being complemented. The first we have here is pretty messy, but we actually use patterns to complement our subjects, as well as foreground, midground, and background elements. To the right, in the foreground of the image, we have a sort of clothing rack with some print just hanging into the side of the frame. Then in the midground, we have our primary subject, who is adjusting his clothes wearing a print shirt. Then in the background behind the subject, we also have another set of clothes racks featuring some printed clothing. A stronger version of this idea is here, and this one has a lot more curiosity baked into it. Our eye is immediately drawn in by the fact that we have this elderly couple both wearing matched printed t-shirts. It's quite clear they're a couple and they're travelling together. But we have these matching printed shirts, and the lady is pointing off camera while the husband is listening, but also has a small bandage just on his elbow. So while we're brought in by the matching printed shirts, we're now curious about what is she pointing at, why has he got a small bandage, what is kind of going on here, and what's going on with them. We all know that ogres have layers, but you know what else has layers? Onions.
Onions have layers.
No, your photography compositions should have layers. Layers in an image can fall into 3 different categories. First is the foreground, second is the midground, and third is the background. Starting with foreground elements, I don't want to bore you here because this seems to be everyone's favourite way to compose images. I did a community poll recently, and this does seem to be the #1 way that people like to compose their images, which is a bit worrying, I'm not going to lie, but foreground elements can be a really useful way for framing subjects in the midground or background of your composition. But also, they're actually a useful way to either clean up your composition if you have some kind of elements that are distracting a little bit, or also to remove context and to remove detail from a subject, which is something that I really enjoy doing. So here's an example of using foreground elements to frame our subject. We just have a few boats in the background, don't hate me, and then we are using leaves and branches in the foreground to be able to frame those subjects. If this was just a shot of the boats with a pretty clear, cliff edge, boats, cliff edge in the foreground, this would have been far less interesting, but it's quite satisfying how the foreground elements manage to frame those subjects. You can get very creative with what you want to use as foreground elements for framing your subjects. Like I failed at attempting here with 2 different guys shooting through their elbow and arm gap with their hands on their hips to try and frame different subjects, that I failed miserably in both attempts, but this is something I definitely want to try and nail sometime. One of my favourite ways to use layering is to find out a way to remove information from the image or from the primary subject themselves. In my head, I like to call this obstructed subjects, but you can call this whatever you want. I've been shooting this theme for some time now, gathering a handful of images that I think kind of work towards something. But recently I captured a new favourite, which you can see on this screen behind me, but I'll show you in full clarity. I was knelt down quite low to get this image, and I used this lamppost to remove the face and the facial expression of the primary subject. Then also in the foreground, someone else in red shorts just stepped into the frame to add a bit of depth and add an extra set of legs and his hand slightly poking into his pocket, which I think just added something a little bit more in terms of curiosity. Now you can achieve this effect with any sort of objects out on the street, whether it's the corner or feature of a building or plants and leaves. You can kind of do this with anyone or anything to be able to try and create some sort of humour or curiosity within your images, which could have been boring if you actually just saw the person doing 100% of what they were actually doing. Sometimes this can actually make a less interesting person more interesting by removing information rather than trying to include as much as possible. It's easy to get up in the wider scenes of street photography, especially when there's beautiful light pouring through a street that looks amazing. These can make for truly stunning images, but recently I've really been enjoying searching for beauty in the details in street photography. I briefly mentioned before hands behind the backs of subjects, and this is one of the themes that I'm kind of photographing more proactively at the moment. These little details are a really interesting way for me to be able to kind of look at the human experience without looking at someone's face. So we don't have to be close up, high clarity, Nat Geo close-up portrait. Sometimes just seeing something that we can all relate to, how we kind of hold our own hands behind our backs, people who fidget, people who hold on to certain things, people who like to play with certain things in their hands. I feel like this is something really interesting and worth looking at. For me, you can sort of see how someone is feeling, either towards the world around them or towards themselves, and we can do this without seeing their close-up facial expression. Through photographing these little details across multiple subjects in multiple cities at multiple times of year, The images are sometimes interesting on their own, but I find them even more interesting when sequenced and looking through them all at once as a whole. And I'll be back next week with a video covering methods of 35mm street photography, so make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out when that video drops.